Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We just had a talk about software functionality and classification, whether your software might be a medical device. And now we're actually going to go to the next level. So that might have been your appetizer. Now we're in the main entree where we have all our friends here. We're going to talk about in just a minute, and we're going to talk about actual designing wearable devices that utilize software as a medical device. In the last talk, I talked a little bit about how you can have software that's unregulated that can actually support these kinds of devices. We're going to focus on actual regulated software and how you can connect that in with wearable devices and how that might work. So, turn it on would help. There we go. As Lori said, I'm Michelle Jump, Vice President of Security Services at MedSec, and I am joined.
Hinton from BigFoot Biomedical.
And I'm Chris Purrier, the Vice President of Development with BigFoot Biomedical.
I'm Shannon Hosty, the President in Agilist Consulting.
And just a little bit of background on the folks that are joining us on the panel today. I'm a regulatory person with a technology slant. CA he's a systems engineer with a very strong security slant, a very good security background, has been working on devices for a long time. And then Chris is more on the bigger picture R&D. So as we're talking about the overall design factors, so Chris and CA both come from BigFoot, and then Shannon is on the human factors side. So what we were trying to do here is bring in all those elements that you want to think about with different folks from different backgrounds on this panel. And this is going to be, there's going to be a little bit of a background. I'm going to talk a little bit about thinking about wearables, kind of where the FDA's position is on wearables. And then we're going to have kind of a Q&A, or we're going to talk through some of the challenges and the things that folks have found on the panel have found useful in thinking about designing SaMD that will work with wearables. Okay? So if you were here in the last session, this slide might look familiar because I use it a lot because I'm not going to go through everything on this slide, but it really gives you a full feel of, this is a slide from the FDA, all of the different types of digital health products that are out there that can be wearable, ingestible, all kinds of different things. And what we do when we look at this slide is we're thinking about how these types of wearables fit into the larger scope and strategy for designing and managing medical devices. One example here would be that we see a lot of the use of SaMD along with hardware-driven medical devices is in digital health and diabetes. This is a huge market. It's a high-risk market, but it's also a high benefit. This is a massive issue in both the US and globally, managing diabetes, better management of diabetes. And so what we're seeing is that there's a lot of automated self-management tools, remote coaching, connections into continuous glucose monitors, decision support for insulin dosing that is just kind of ripe for this type of a discussion around wearables, where you might have the monitor as a wearable along with software, SaMD type products that connect in with this. And this is where I wanted to ask our friends from BigFoot to talk a little bit about the Unity Diabetes Management System. We'll kind of fall back on this as an example as we're talking through the different questions today, but do one of you guys want to take a shot at just talking to them a little bit?
Absolutely, Michelle. Thank you. So BigFoot Unity is a brand new digital health system specifically intended to help ease the emotional, physical, and cognitive burden that comes along with managing type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So BigFoot Biomedical started about 7 years ago. We just got our first 510K clearance earlier this year. And we've worked very closely with Michelle and her team as we bring to the table a lot of robust experience in diabetes and insulin management and building systems. We don't claim to know it all. And so we've actually gone through this journey of software as a medical device in a very unique situation. So you can see the various components of the system there. The way we are acquiring data is via that little circular sensor. That's a Freestyle Libre 2 sensor, CGM, continuous glucose monitoring sensor from Abbott Diabetes Corporation. And we use that as our predicate device. And what that does is streams glucose information to our system. So we have two smart pen caps that are both BLE and NFC enabled that you can use to scan the sensor and get real-time insulin glucose information, along with programming on our medical device. Software is a medical device, which is our app that runs on the iOS platform now and Android soon, to calculate and infer dose amounts for the end user. So then they can just, without having to reference anything else, use the pen cap, scan the sensor, get their dosing amount, dose, and they're off. So it's a new, unique system. It's targeted for type 1 and type 2 diabetes. We're in the process of kind of doing a minimally viable launch across the US right now. So it should be coming to your neighborhoods soon.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the thought here was, as we walk through, I'm going to continue to talk to you a little bit about kind of where FDA is on this and kind of the overall market, and then we're gonna actually do some questions to the panel, and we're gonna ask them from their different perspectives how they think about some of the challenges in this space. So thanks, Chris. So there are some. I feel like you guys can't hear me. That feels better. So there are some considerations, and again, this is coming from FDA. This is the considerations they recommend. As a regulatory person, I always like to just go back and just leverage what the FDA says themselves. So thinking about wearable design, it's very important to think about the location of use, the intended duration of use, battery life, things like that, device storage capacity and connectivity. This is a big issue around the cybersecurity aspect, because some of the things that regulators and or other security specialists might think is really important, it's very difficult to do that on a wearable device. So the computing capacity, the storage capacity has to be considered when you're thinking about things like security and overall data storage for things that are wearable, because you don't want this big clunky thing with a massive battery sitting on your body. Frequency of updates, right? How often do you think you're going to have to update this product that's on a person, right? It's very different if you can have service personnel go into the hospital, collect all, say, the infusion pumps and do a mass update of all of them, or even better, let the hospital know you're going to do a remote update and all of the devices, just need to be checked before they go back online. If you are on a person, you don't want to necessarily have to do a lot of updates. So thinking about that and planning for that, about how you're going to communicate that and test that is really important. And then feedback from the device user. This is a huge part of a push from the digital health group at FDA, is they want more and more information gathered from users so you can get direct feedback on this software that's directly interacting with patients to make better designs. There are 4 goals that FDA has assigned for harnessing wearable data. 1 is develop benchmarks and standards for emerging tech. 2 is generate good clinical evidence. Some of that would be initially before launch, but FDA is switching a lot more to post-market generation of clinical evidence. If you have the ability to see data that's being used directly throughout your market, then they want to see you using it, following it, and managing it, and making sure that you have a good idea if things are going off the reservation. Number 3, providing insights to real-world digital health product performance. This follows in with that collecting clinical evidence to making sure that your product is working well. Also, looking at product performance and making sure that wearable is doing what you expect it to do after you've tested it. Shannon probably has some interesting stories about when that has gone wrong from a usability perspective. We expect it worked great in the lab, right? But not so much once it got out to the field and you get a lot of diverse populations, different use case scenarios. And then just on that continued aspect that the digital health group loves so much is fostering continuous improvement of digital health information. In case you missed it, there is a trend here of there isn't this work really hard to design it, get through the FDA, and then just kind of passively monitor. With digital health products, the FDA is much more interested in the shift of the balance of oversight moving to the post-market space and really paying attention to what your product is doing in the field rather than putting so much work just in the beginning and then kind of leaving it passively there. This is the first set of questions that we have when you're thinking about harnessing wearable data from a privacy, security, interoperability, data integrity, generalizability, meaning does the data make sense for entire populations or just subsets of populations, and governance. All the kinds of things that you want to think about. I'll just start with the first one. Anyone on the panel wants to take this question about what do you think about from the privacy perspective about patients getting control of how and when their data is used?
Well, I was thinking of some things as you were talking, and I think it will potentially be part of the challenge on the privacy. So as you think about, and you're hearing in the current landscape with AI/ML, with patient-reported outcomes, a lot of the concern is diversity in the data. Is a diverse data set? How is this product or therapy being delivered, and how is it affecting different racial, ethnic populations? And so as I think about the value, and I think this is part of the driving factor in that post-market push, is understanding and getting that broader population and input on reports. But that then means that there are different data streams that would be helpful to generalize that data as it comes in. And where is that line in reporting patient characteristics maybe, as opposed to, say, privacy and data protection?
Are you seeing a trend, just as a follow-on question on that, are you seeing a trend in companies being more comfortable collecting privacy scoped data versus stripped data? Because if you really want to really trend it, back to that generalizability issue, you need more information than, and it will become PHI, right? So have you guys struggled with that, or have you seen like trends in that space of being, there was always this, I don't want to handle PHI.
Very conservative
approach. What have you guys thought about that?
PHI is endemic throughout our system, and we've given a fair amount of thought to how we can do our best to protect patient privacy, yet be able to do things like identify problem accounts, bring them solutions, investigate complaints. So we've given a lot of thought, we've got a lot of documentation and processes in place, and we're monitoring. So it's an ongoing thing.
Security, favorite topic. When you're thinking about security and privacy, when you're dealing with wearable data, does it produce any specific challenges from a wearable perspective in collecting data from wearable devices versus other kinds of devices, as far as protecting it from being accessed by third parties, malicious intent, things like that?
Well, we're kind of in a unique situation in our partnership with Abbott in their Freestyle Libre sensor. So it is our predicate device. So we do a lot in our regulatory filing around how we actually integrate that into our system. So the luxury that we have is from a security perspective and a privacy perspective is first as an entrance into our system from a pure data perspective, having them attest to adhering to privacy standards and so on and so forth. And then what we do is we actually work on a number of cybersecurity controls in the best faith effort in that partnership to further protect their secret sauce, which is the library, and then our secret sauce on top of that. So there's a lot of obfuscation and reverse engineering, threat modeling tactics that we actually go through, the help of Michelle and her team, to ensure that it's as tight as controlled as it could be.
So you found a lot of benefit from working directly and collaboratively with the wearable manufacturer to make sure that that connection is secure and that you have all the information you need.
Correct.
Probably be a lot harder if you were trying to do it outside of that collaboration.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And that probably comes to the same point with the interoperability as well. Did you have something? to add?
Right, I was
Yeah.
just going to mention interoperability standards around this, as well as obviously we have a business relationship agreement governing controls and reporting and monitoring.
I guess I also want to bring up the usability aspect.
Yes.
That's what I do. Is just as you're thinking about the security and the data protection, that is another scenario in the use scenarios that you might want to think about from your usability perspective, is how do the end users understand that their data is protected? What steps do they need to take to maintain that? If something goes wrong and a communication needs to be made, do they understand that and do they know how to react? So just making sure that that is a consideration in the overall use scenarios, in addition to general use of the product.
And that also reminds me of a really good connection to a current effort out of the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council, which is a security group that put out the Joint Security Plan for medical devices. You might have heard of that. One of their task groups that came out of that effort was the vulnerability communication. And so, to ride on to your point, and we get this question quite a bit, is, how do we, if our users are not hospitals that have staff who understand security lingo, how do we communicate with directly with a patient to let them know that patches are coming, or if, say, not something any of us want to have, but there's a high risk vulnerability that's been released about the product. We don't want people to be panicking that they have this wearable device that's very important to their health, but now they're worried that someone's going to hack in and hurt them, right? So how do we make sure that communications aren't overly scary, that they're clear, not too tech driven? One of the things of that vulnerability communication group that we were just at their meeting, and they were talking about this, is their litmus test of anything that they're using and recommended terminology in vulnerability communication, especially when it's patient facing, is, will my mom understand this message, right? Because I've been in the security field for a long time, and sometimes I look at some of the vulnerability communications and I'm like I don't know how anyone outside of this deep security geek world would understand what we're even talking about, right? So it becomes really important when you're dealing with wearables that have security issues that you're communicating in a way that makes sense to the people who are the intended recipients of it, and they don't worry, right? There's been heart implant questions where people, they don't know what's inside them because they don't have a label, right? They lost their card a long time ago, and then they get really worried about it. So being very careful about that. I mean, obviously that's an implantable versus a wearable, but so coming back to harnessing the wearable data integrity, right? Something that we want to make sure is maintained and understood. Is there anything that you guys would advise on, maybe from a testing perspective, making sure that the information you're getting from that wearable is being properly interpreted, captured from a data integrity point of view?
Sure. We, well, first of all, the data integrity is kind of baked into the design, and it ties into security since we encrypt data at rest and encrypt data in flight. So we do that in addition to the testing where we provide a known input and confirm that we get that output. And then that integrity theme follows the data from the sensor to the prescribing physician's office. So across that whole spectrum, we are looking at entry points and exit entry points between the modules and ensuring that we have the correct controls in place.
So you test end to end, even though it's not your device on that one end. Yeah.
Yes.
One of the areas I've seen, particularly in the wearable space, it's not so much a data integrity as in precision and accuracy standpoint, but from the understanding of where that data is going. So some wearable devices may be collecting data that's locally available to the patient. Sometimes that may be communicated to a designated caregiver, sometimes to the healthcare clinician, sometimes some variant thereof. But the question comes in is, does the user understand when that information is being communicated and to what level? So, I mean, there's the obvious case of, this isn't an emergency communication that's going to your doctor, but if is the user assuming that every time they record their reading that it's being cataloged at their healthcare practitioner, and maybe that's not the way the system is designed. So again, just clarity and transparency in where that data is living and who's accessing it for what purpose.
From a governance point of view, do you find that patients with wearable devices understand that you're sharing that data elsewhere and where it's going, or is that pretty straightforward, or are there challenges with that?
I know in my personal experience in some of the products that I've taken a look at, it was the opposite. It was the patient was understanding or expecting that that data was being received by their clinician and being reviewed by their clinician, which may not have been the case. And it may have been possible if they set it up, but it wasn't a default, things like that. And their automatic assumption was, this is high tech. I'm taking this measurement, it's going into, some cloud somewhere, and
Magically
therefore,
connect my doctor.
yeah, my doctor is looking at it. And so that's been more of the concern I've seen from the risk perspective.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. Awesome. So, digging a little deeper into specific questions around design, I'd like you guys to each answer this individually from your different perspectives. What's the number one issue you think is being faced by design and development teams when it comes to wearable devices? Yeah, you want to?
The number one issue is the sensor giving you the right answer?
That's an important part.
Number two, will the sensor continue giving you that right answer across a range of environmental conditions and over time? And then after all of that, can we keep that data under control and safe? So those are my top three.
And that's why CA doesn't sleep, because he doesn't have just one, he has three.
Yeah. So I think I complement that a little bit, and this might sound apropos, but I would actually say risk. So risk management is a huge one, and I think whether it's starting from the user side with use related risk analysis to kind of product level all the way down to component and subcomponent parts of the system. If you can get a jump on that, and part of what that does is it really forces you to kind of think about some of these kind of inputs and outputs of the system before you even start developing anything. If you can get a good handle on that, you can use it as a valuable guide through the development process. What Michelle alluded to in the previous discussion around clinical decision support, and now in this one in the context of the FDA and med device quality, it's not just a one and done. It's a continual kind of care, sunlight, water, feeding. They're really dynamic, living, breathing documents. And so if you can kind of force yourself to discipline around that process up front, it makes life so much easier throughout the product development cycle. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Took my answer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just kidding. Two things jumped to my mind. The first one is change control and management of post-market changes in particular, and that process. But I completely agree that a key to that is that risk management architecture and that backbone of being able to make those decisions and justify those decisions to market forward. The one thing I'd say that I see, and this is a combination of both wearables and in vitro diagnostic space, is in both of those, a lot of your hazards are informational. So as you're doing the input-output mapping and setting up your risk file, a lot of the outputs that can become hazards and hazardous situations are informational based. So whether that's output information from the measurement, a positive or a negative result, is it a true positive or a false positive, so forth. And then even the information out, say, from a security breach, or information out from a hardware issue that is breaking your communication stream or something along those lines. And so really having the risk management architecture to be able to manage and understand those hazards, and probe down in to understand what are the failure modes that can cause those and control those.
I was really curious what your answer was going to be. Oh my goodness, I got way close on that. I was really curious about what your answer was going to be, because Shannon and I used to work together at a large medical device manufacturer, and she actually deconstructed and then stood from the ground up our entire design control system. And you can imagine a person who specializes in human factors and usability redesigning your quality system. Yeah, so I was very curious what you were saying. Thank you. And we'll start down there this way, so you can steal Chris's this time. Yeah. Excellent. What are the most important elements to consider when it comes to the user in terms of human factors design? Actually, this is, I think, just for you. But you know what? If you guys want to answer it too, but we'll start with Shannon.
With regards to the user, so, and I'm thinking here, a little bit gets back to the last conversation, but as you're looking at that risk management process, or say in vitro diagnostics even, the output of that data could be going to a clinician, or it could be going to the patient, right? And so understanding what are the potential hazards and hazardous situations for each of those different user groups. And the controls could be different as well. So how does a clinician, when they're seeing a result, understand if it's accurate? Can they trust that? And you see this with AI/ML as well. What went into that decision, or the guidance that's being supplied to them, and when is the system brittle, so that they can understand that they need to ask more questions. So understanding making sure you're looking at the various user groups that are interfacing with the product, and understanding what are all of the hazards. And so it's part of that, having that risk management architecture that's thorough enough to catch those.
Chris or CA, did you guys have particular issues around designing for human factors when you think about the fact that you were connecting with someone else's manufactured wearable, right? And then you're creating an interface for their phone, right, that they see. Did you guys have any challenges of making sure that the interpretation was not lost from a human factors or usability point of view? Or did that produce any particular issues for you?
We followed our predicate manufacturers' user interface guidelines and their actual designs, and we partnered very closely with them to make sure that a user that might be using an app or a reader with their sensor would have no trouble understanding what was going on when they looked at it on either, if they looked at it on their mobile device. So we try to keep that as equivalent as possible.
Excellent. Then you also have all of that post-market data.
What's that?
You also have all that post-market data as well. So how is the system, since you're building off of a predicate, how is that in current use?
So this next question, can you share some examples across various wearable sectors around who's doing it well, right? You guys have gotten a chance to talk about how you have done it there at BigFoot and, battled some of those challenges. And Shannon, you work from an advisory perspective of seeing a lot of different companies. And, have you seen some particular interesting approaches where wearable sensors are combined with SaMD type products in a good way?
I'll give a for example.
For example.
I'm thinking of, I won't go into specifics, but I'm thinking of a sensor that may be communicating. You can have a sensor that's communicating output directly on the sensor. With the move to more integrated technologies and SaMD, that now could then be transmitted to a phone interface or an iPhone or a tablet interface. At which point the display on the sensor itself, in theory, could go away. So when that happens and your mobile interface is now your primary interface, there are new questions, right? And questions about maintaining communication and again, the usability questions of the user understanding when they have alerts and not. But I have seen a lot of active work in that space, and I've seen a lot of companies doing it well over the last few years even, and move to a more of that integrated, I guess maybe separate interface from the device itself. So.
Yeah, I see great points. I think one of the things that's definitely apparent right now is that there's a lot of people trying really hard to do this well. And I know whether that is in the regulated space or the unregulated space or even the consumer space, there's a lot of folks. I mean, it's almost like a race, right, to the space. And I think what actually perks our eyes up in terms of not who's doing it well and who's not, but it's, as we're talking about the migration to a mobile platform, for example, and software as a medical device, you've got unique situations of the various platforms that are out there and how applications and other devices that are interacting with that platform that have nothing to do with your SaMD could potentially impact it when it gets out there in the wild. So with our very limited launch this year, we're actually in the process of starting to do some of that post-market surveillance. And as we bring our Android offering to the table, it just because of the nature of Android being more open source, it brings in some additional threats and vectors and things that we have to kind of keep front of mind. So there's a lot of companies out there that specialize in doing this and doing it well, but it's pulling the whole package together and presenting it as a service, product, or solution. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I also was particularly, as a mom of teenagers right now, so they're a little bit more independent. But as a mom, I'm particularly intrigued by the way that some of these SaMD products and apps on your phone allow you to see wearables on your child, right? Knowing and having the confidence, I've read these stories where, parents can have the app on their phone so they can actually monitor what's happening with their child, and they don't have to go with them every time. That child can be a little bit more independent. I think for a while Ford was talking about actually having the ability to read from the car dashboard for their child, in the back seat, and they can actually. I never saw that actually launch. They probably realized that risk management within the regulated medical device field was maybe above their comfort level, but I thought it was an interesting idea. But I think that when you're thinking about the impact to not just the patient, but also the caregivers of those patients, it really gives a lot more freedom than they might not have otherwise had.
That's a great point. I'll just do a little plug for BigFoot Biomedical. That was actually the reason why BigFoot Biomedical was created. So our two founders actually were Wall Street financial guys in New York. They both had children that were type 1. And so they decided there has to be a better way than sweating through the night as a caregiver, worrying about whether or not my son or daughter is going to go hyper or hypo. And so they actually did just that. They took a Sony Ericsson phone and a little camera and put it on their son's nightstand in his room, and every 5 minutes it would turn the light on and the camera on and touch the CGM, take a picture of the value, and text it to their phone. And that's the idea of trying to ease that cognitive burden through kind of remote physiological monitoring at the end of the day.
Just a quick story. Earlier in my career, late 90s, late 2000, I was working on Insulin Devices, and it had a memory function. And I got a letter from a parent that said, the first day we had this device was the first time I knew my child received their dose at school today. And it was probably the best feedback I've ever gotten on my job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So often we just think of the patients, but it's actually there's that caregiver aspect that just you know, has huge impact. So. All right. So the technology aspects of trying to connect, I can only imagine, especially when you don't own that device that's the wearable, right? And trying to deal with that. But if you are actually creating the wearable and the SaMD, and maybe this is a question for Shannon, when you're trying to make these decisions around how to, or maybe this isn't for, no, I'll be honest with you, I don't actually remember where we were going with this.
Question.
Hardware decision questions.
I
CA, you gonna save me?
I think that's the one that I was answering with the 3 answers.
I gotcha.
You know, the most important thing to realize is that that sensor isn't out there by itself. For the sensor to be useful, the data for that sensor has to get to some intermediate place and then make its way first to the person who's using it, wearing it, secondly to caregiver or someone that's monitoring it. So at the sensor level, yes, it's about hardware, and yes, that hardware has to meet performance and power and have the crypto capabilities to anchor trust. Those are the 3 big.
We all like compiled all these questions together, and I was trying to remember. They're not flagged for who gets the different questions. So you guys are good. Okay, cybersecurity is a hot topic right now. We've talked a little bit about that from the initial set of questions, but from a cybersecurity perspective, when you're connecting with a wearable device, what is the most important thing that you guys would identify as critical for considering that connection between the SaMD and wearable?
So I would say reliability and durability. You know, a lot of what separates, I would say, consumer wearables in the health and fitness space from a true regulated medical device is that level of quality and repeatability in a safe and effective manner. And so I think as we look at, as CA mentioned, environments like this that are noisy, there's probably 1 million, you know, BLE antennas in here and Wi-Fi and the whole 9 yards. You still have to make sure that it's durable under stress and can operate, and that the patient or end user can rely on it.
I think the other, just to pile on with complications, is as you mentioned earlier, the platform that the SaMD is on. So if you're talking like iOS, you know, what's the device, what's the OS version, what updates are coming out and running on those. So just other additional considerations as you're developing that.
All right. So we have one more slide here. We're going to talk a little bit about specific data considerations. Then we're going to open it up for questions. We have some additional questions that we have in an additional slide, but we want to make sure that we have sufficient time for questions from the audience too. So does anyone want to talk a little bit about analytic validity when you're thinking about collecting data, reproducibility, accuracy, precision of that data? And this is actually from the FDA, these considerations, and maybe tying this back into the submission process and how you demonstrate this type of information. We've talked a little bit about how these are important and how we design them in, but from this slide, I would like to kind of move back to how do you defend that you've done this, right? And how do you package that in and document it, that your analytical validity has been sufficiently met?
In our case, our interoperability relationship helps us answer questions about data quality and reliability. However, again, since we're a wearable in an ecosystem, what that means is that a person wearing a sensor may not be close to their phone. And so are we getting sufficient data in actual use to support the decision-making of that person with diabetes? I think that's a big one for us.
It's good on me.
Just a random thought exercise. As I'm looking at these questions, I'm thinking about kind of the basis for these questions. And in the, say, CGM space, right, there can be established standards and in glucose monitoring in general, standards for accuracy and such. But I think of a current case that we have is the COVID diagnostics and what we see happening in that landscape. And it kind of puts a little bit of a different perspective on these filters, right? Of, you could have clinical validity, but also getting tests on the market that for something when there were no tests on the market for it before. I think there's much more variability in some of those accuracy results on things on the market than there may be in other circumstances, right? And I know personally, as I was looking at, buying kits to send out to my staff before they go out to a study, right? I'm looking, okay, what are the false positive rates on this? What are the complaints going in? But that's something that I think on an established.
Isn't a normal mom question, but
Well,
it is a science mom question.
Yeah. Okay. But just understanding and in an established space that isn't running all on emergency use authorizations, right? I can rely on the fact that it is cleared or approved from that standpoint.
Yeah, and just to follow on that, it is kind of interesting because I'm not sure how many folks here know that most of, if not all of the COVID-related testing and vaccines and everything else are actually under emergency use authorization. So the information that you're seeing is actually, it's fully vetted by the FDA, but it is going through a shortcut path so we can get it out because the communities need it. And so
what I think it gives us is a unique lens to kind of think through when you're thinking through these questions for your product, kind of pushing on the boundaries of that question, right? What is the benefit that I'm introducing? What are the risks associated with that? And is there a value in a product maybe that's not to the gold standard but provides faster results, right? And so just kind of using that as a stress test maybe to think around the boundaries.
That same risk-benefit analysis we've been talking about the last 2 sessions, yeah. So with that, are there any questions that the audience has for our panel? Yes.
Hello, Shannon Clark, UserWise. Thanks so much for the great panel discussion. Actually, you said risk-benefit just now, so I thought I'd ask this question. Shannon, have you been able to persuade your clients to enter into that risk-benefit process? I find that my clients just try to avoid it like the plague. Like, say you have failed, quote-unquote failed human factors validation results. It seems like they're trying to do backflips to not follow into that process, but have you had success kind of navigating that process of preparing a risk-benefit justification?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge because it's entering into, risk management in general. Okay, I'm going to get on a soapbox here. Risk management in general is a qualitative process, right? So whether it's use risk or security or accuracy risk, right? You're assessing what is that risk and then what is the clinical benefit. You're doing that qualitative assessment. We try to make it quantitative by putting numbers on it, and we can in some cases, like reliability. But in many cases, we're trying to create scales and measure, and I think that makes particularly engineers guilty, uncomfortable, right? How do we make those business decisions based on qualitative assessments? But I think part of the challenge is, and I think we mentioned this earlier, in setting up that risk architecture that gives you a framework to do that in, and making sure that you have that documentation that you can then refer back to as part of the guidance and input on that decision. But I do see sometimes there are challenges in helping folks make decisions based on that data and making sure they have the right support on both the risk side and the benefit side, and plugging in the right people, the clinicians and the engineers and such.
Chris, anything you want to add to the risk-benefit conversation? Because I think it comes up in so much of these, especially these connections with devices that you don't manufacture, and trying to make that good balance of what you're trying to offer, to both patients as well as their caregivers, but then also the challenge of the risks that you're dealing with.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting scenario because there's actually more at play at the end of the day there. So you're balancing the risk benefit of we call the PWD, or the person with diabetes, the caregiver, the clinician, the HCP, et cetera. And I think the intent is to address the core use cases in your system. And I think we're at a unique spot where we sit in a larger enterprise system that's slowly evolving. And so our risk-benefit discussions are continually, I think, only expanding to encapsulate a wider purview, if you will. I'm going to see if there's anything else right now.
No, that's pretty much it. It's it's hard to measure as you move away from the person wearing the sensor to the caregiver and the clinician. It becomes a little more difficult to actually measure their benefit. It becomes more subjective. What we hang our hat on is that our patients are more effectively controlling their disease and providing the data to support that, as well as the processes to support those patients in that use is really what it's about.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just closing it out from your point of like, how do you convince people, right? To acknowledge that. I think, I work almost exclusively in cybersecurity now, haven't always, have always been a risk management geek, even back in our days together, Shannon. But I think it's particularly challenging when you're dealing with security where it's like, oh, no one would do that, right? And so you get this, with security risk management, you're often challenged with what you're trying to get the device not to do versus what you're trying to get it to do in other parts of design. And so the no one would ever do that is getting less and less favorable and less common, but it still exists of like, who would really, steal my phone to mess with my app so that my blood glucose levels aren't being accurately captured, right? Or hack into my phone. But that's where risk management becomes so important, because it's very difficult to do full quantitative estimations of likelihood with security. You really have to look at how easy is it and what's the benefit to someone doing this. I think I hit something because you.
Yeah. Well, okay. That's a question, Shannon. I think another just point I wanted to quickly make is I think usability, human factors, and software both have the same issue where a user interface or software will never be perfect, right? You will have anomalies, or you will have things that could confuse a user. And so each of those then goes through, like a disposition process like you would use in software to determine what's the risk and does it need to be fixed or not. And so it's that same logic on the usability side of, is this an issue we can live with, or is it something that needs to be fixed? Because at the end of the day, you need to get the benefit on the market. And so coming up with a way to best categorize and manage all of that can be challenging. Yeah.
One of the, I think I'm okay to share this story. One of the challenges we faced with risk-benefit analysis was when you think about cybersecurity, you log into your app when you open the phone. If your phone If your app goes out of focus and you come back, well, my gosh, there's data there, there's PHI there. So of course you should log in again, right? But on the other hand, if you're coming back to use the app because you're having some sort of glucose alarm or other activity, then usability trumps security. But we had to talk about that for a while to make sure we were okay with it.
Yeah.
And we documented it.
So such a good answer. Yeah, and that is such a big issue with looking. And in fact, Shannon and I did a presentation on that often sibling rivalry between human factors and cybersecurity, and which one is driving end decisions. And really, they should be coupled, right? But it's not always easy to do that. So, any other questions from the audience?
This is more of an engineering question. You
Oh,
talked
can't-
about more about engineering question. You said there are it's all about sensors, and sensors are basically signals going in and signals coming out. Do you have anything that would say something new and different? I'm referring back to a few years ago, Tim Cook made a big statement that he can detect cancer. And I don't think that there's, we are not even close to that. So I was wondering if you can comment on sensors. And secondly, if FDA have seen anything, of course, diabetes is number one, but if
Can you
FDA,
just bring your, sorry.
has FDA seen newer devices with other diseases that are diagnosed in advance?
So are you asking about new designs and sensors that can detect things we hadn't been able to detect before? Okay. I'm not personally aware of that. I have a little bit of a discussion around sensors and focus from the FDA, but I want to give our panel a chance to talk about if they've seen anything interesting.
Yeah, and I didn't catch the second part of your question, so I want to make sure that we loop back to that. I think, any of the sensors, I think under development right now, that's what makes it so interesting in terms of the race. I think, a lot of that stuff, there's a lot of talk, but whether or not it's quantitative and qualitative at the end of the day. Even from our small little startup perspective, we were going to tie onto something that already existed. To Michelle's point earlier, there's a lot of opportunity to take what's already existing in the world and make it simple. And that's also a race in terms of risk benefit, whether you invest a bunch of money in innovating to try to get to that space. So.
Did we answer your full question? Okay. One other thing to just keep in mind from a regulatory point of view, because that's my area of expertise, is FDA, like when I started in med device in 2010, I think it was, 2008, the infusion pump guidance came out. And so it was infusion pump, risk management, every day, all day, everything about infusion pumps. So there's often things that the FDA takes up and takes a focus on. If your area is where the FDA is focused on, congratulations. Your product's going to be awesome because they're going to take a very close look at it. So what I wanted to share is sensors.
AIML.
Sensors are currently kind of on their target list from both security perspective as well as overall functionality and risk of sensors, because there's just been such a huge explosion. So keep particularly close watch on what FDA is talking about and their focus on sensors, because they've seen a big push on it and they see some potential risk there. So whenever our regulators pay attention to something, we should also pay attention to it. So just to be aware of that recent presentation I was listening to. So, any other questions? We have 5 more minutes. Okay.
Oh, we've got 1 minute.
Oh, we got 1 more. 4 more minutes. Run, Lori, run.
Actually, this is just a follow-up on what you just said. Is there a current guidance released on sensors, or was that a presentation, or where was that information coming from?
Yeah, excellent question. I don't remember if I said it in this particular session or if it was the one before, but FDA is a bit hamstrung right now because of COVID. Guidance has been stuck. So no, it's not. It's not actually in guidance. It is from presentations that the FDA has done, talking about where, and this was particularly for security, and the concerns that they have over design of certain elements of medical device. They have stated that they're putting a particular focus on sensors, from a security point of view particularly. But if they're focusing on security, you can probably guess that there's a lot of discussion within the agency overall. So when I hear stuff like that, I just try to share it. It's not specific guidelines, but just knowing that they're putting a particular focus on it. You can sometimes Google sensors and FDA and come up with slide shares and things like that. But right now, it's one of our best ways of getting information right now is to listen directly to the FDA, because they are doing their best to communicate that. They've been on a lot, they do a lot of virtual conferences and discuss these things, but the actual written guidance is really delayed right now, which has been a challenge for us overall in industry. But thank you for the question. Okay.
Having formerly been at the agency, it's time consuming to release a guidance.
Yes, Shannon actually did work at the agency.
Hello, here's Wojciech from company Mapster. I have a question for Chris. You said that you use other device from other supplier and build your device. How do you run the risk analysis in this case?
The risk management of that?
Yeah.
So the question was, how do you kind of balance the risk management when you're using Abbott's device and your app, and the balance of who owns the risk? Is that the question? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you directed that to me, but I'm gonna lean into CA here because he is our expert, in-house expert on that.
So our first line of defense is the interoperability standard that our partner's device has been cleared and certified to meet that standard. Secondly, we keep in regular touch with them about and have as part of our working agreement ongoing monitoring and communications around not just security, but device complaints, things of that nature. So it's pretty well delineated, and how at the end of the day, it's still our system that we are ultimately responsible for that risk.
One little weird, crazy little nugget of information to add to that, and this came from a conversation with the FDA I had that justified my travel budget for the rest of the year. So if you were here in the first session, we were talking about MDDS, medical device data systems. These are no longer medical devices. However, there was a preamble, which is like the front matter that comes out when there's a regulation change. So that preamble is kind of like the thoughts behind the regulation. People, unless you're a regulatory geek, you don't really
This is the
care
preamble
about.
to CARES Act?
No, this is preamble to the MDDS regulation. And so I was asking a question about how to interpret the guidance and understand whether a product fell under an MDDS rule or whether it was not. Because the guidance said we couldn't use the MDDS rule. And so I was asking what our options were from executive at the FDA after a completely unrelated meeting that we had at the agency. And the answer was, go read the preamble of the MDDS regulation, because it actually talks very clearly about how to balance risk assignment from the MDDS versus the device that's connected to the MDDS. And so if you read that, and I gave you my card earlier, if anyone, it is not the easiest thing to find. I'm happy to give you my card, or you can give me your card and I can send it to you. But it is a really, really nice description. The MDDS regulation, which I do not have memorized, the preamble to that talks about how you balance the assignment of risk when you have a low risk MDDS, now no longer a medical device, and a product that's connected to, and who owns that risk, and how they justified reducing the risk level of the MDDS versus keeping the risks owned by the device that it's connected to. So the FDA has actually talked about this. The regulation talked about it. And it's a very good discussion, and I still leverage it. I wrote a white paper about it internally. And I found it very valuable in understanding that risk balance within connected devices and where you assign the risk and balance that. So we are a couple minutes over. Sorry, Hillary. And sorry, audience. Hopefully that was helpful. Thank you so much for joining us today, and please join me in thanking our panel for joining us today. So.